I wanted to thank everyone for coming. This is pretty exciting on somewhat short notice. I'm Brandon Gamble, and of course this is Dr. Harold Dent. And I'm going to share his bio in just a moment, but I do want to just thank everyone again for coming. It's Sunday, and I know I got a few school psychologists giving up their Sunday to come and learn, so as I know y'all have to be excited to be here. I'm very excited as well. I had a chance to ride with the Dents on the way over, so and just to talk with Dr. Dent was really very exciting. So I'm going to share his bio, and I wasn't able to get it on my iPad for some reason, but here it goes. Dr. Harold Dent is a native of Southampton, New York, where he was born on the Shinnecock Indian Reservation. His mother's Native American and his father's African American. He grew up in Greenwich Villages for his formative years. During World War II, at 17, I believe, he enlisted in the Army and continued to earn his...
Didn't want to go to school.
Right, right. But nonetheless, while he was there, he earned his GED in 2 different types of GED, then still came back to his local high school after he was in the Army to earn his full diploma, as it were. As a young soldier, he learned a great deal about psychiatry and psychology in his mission operations specialty there, or the thing that he's assigned to do in the military. After the war, he went back to school, earned his diploma, then earned his BA in psychology from NYU in 1953, an MA in psychology from Denver University in 1955, and a PhD from the University of Hawaii in 1966. I asked him if he learned to surf there as well. That's where I learned how to surf, but he said no. Not during that time, but I don't know. He still may be open to it. We'll see. Among many other titles, he has been the coordinator of pupil personnel services for Berkeley Unified School District. He's also the coordinator of collaborative outreach at the National Center for Minority Special Education Research Outreach at Hampton University, historically black college and university. His latest title was as Executive Officer of Human Resource Consultants Incorporated. He's been among the first black psychologists to help found the Association of Black Psychologists. In his career, he has worked to reduce racial bias in juror selection, in missions in college, as well as in policing. And most relevant to school psychology, he has testified in court cases regarding testing bias and IQ testing and interpretation for African American students in the San Francisco area, which, as you may know, has impacted school psychology practice throughout California. Dr. Dent lives in Virginia, I believe, and enjoys traveling to visit family across the United States, as brought him here, and we're very fortunate he was here on this side of the country. So he called me and said, where he actually sent me a Facebook message. And he said, I'm coming to California, and we've talked about being able to have a dialogue like this for quite some time, and so we were able to make that happen. And I really want to thank his wife Joanne, because I know how it is to be able to get out and do stuff, and his family here. I'm so glad they're here. So with that being said, I'm giving a little more introduction, but I also do have something, so I'm going to remember. Anyone here from CAS? Yeah. Okay, good. So I'm going to look back at you. I'm just giving myself a clue. I have a thing I have to present from CASP later on. But I did want to get right into some thoughts I had this weekend in particular. We're both members of the same fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi. And I'm talking about that particularly because this weekend I went to an event. It was the 50th anniversary of the chapter at Cal State Long Beach, so the first African-American organization at Cal State Long Beach. And in the mix during that time, you had people like Tom Bradley, who would later go on to become the mayor, but he was also very big in Kappa, the fraternity there, and he became the Grand Polemarch out of LA. This is in the 60s. You had people like Joe White, and if anyone's ever heard of EOP, but he's also a founding member of the Association of Black Psychologists, but he's also another one of my Kappa brothers. And so people were mentioning him last night as we were having this banquet, and they were talking about the impact that psychologists had even on their activities on college campuses during the civil rights movement. And so several of those and I'm calling them young brothers because they were out on the dance floor later on, but who were in school during the 60s were speaking of this time where there was a lot of focus on what we can do to make the world a better place in many different ways. And it was exciting to see they still had that same fire and they still have that same passion. I'm sitting here with Dr. Dent today, and we had that same passion. So, all that being said, just giving you kind of a context of why I'm so excited, a little amped up. And I'll be quiet. I'm going to ask a few questions here, and I know Dr. Dent has many other things he wanted to share. But my first question was, Dr. Dent, what is it that you wanted to share the most with either students or practitioners coming up? Because you really had a burden to want to come and share.
Well, I have, I think it occurred to me when I retired, after I retired, I was asked to come back and teach a couple of psychology classes at a local university. And one of the things that struck me was that there was very little mention. All the books said there was a discussion of diversity. But when I really looked over the table of contents and chapters, I found very little about Association of Black Psychologists or about the accomplishments of black psychologists that I have been involved in. And so I decided that it took me back to my graduate school at the University of Hawaii. Everybody likes to go to Hawaii, right? They did in those days anyway. And we had the opportunity to get to talk and to be with people who were writing our books at that time. And so that was something that I have missed as an opportunity for graduate students and other students to get acquainted with the people that they read about or they have read and learn about the things that they have done. And so that's why I have, on a few occasions, been asked to speak with graduate students. A cousin of mine teaches in law school. I've made these comments and these discussions about my work in law and psychology. And so I just wanted to share with people. So I thank you for taking the opportunity or taking the time to come here. And I particularly want to thank the Dean who made it possible for us to be here on San Diego State University. It's been a pleasure for me to get to share with young people and others in the field.
So, going back to your initial interest in psychology, how did that come about?
Very, very fortunately, I was too eager to, well, I wasn't eager to go to school. So I joined the Army when I was 17 and was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia. You can imagine what a 17-year-old kid from New York City experiences when I got to Fort Benning, Georgia. But luckily, I was transferred from an infantry outfit to a medical outfit. Well, I had an MOS, military occupational specialty, as a surgical technician. And they needed people at the hospital, so they sent me and several others to work at the hospital. And one night, the one individual who was working on the psychiatric ward got injured, and guess who replaced him?
Right.
And that was me. A 17-year-old kid, skinny, was put on a ward, and I was probably more scared than any of the patients there, but I learned to get over my fear, and the psychiatrist helped me a great deal. They even wanted me to go on to social work school. In the Army, they have a social work school, but you have to have 2 years of college in order to get accepted into this program. And so one of the chief psychiatrists wrote and asked them to accept me with a waiver. But the Army was so long responding to it, I was about ready to get out when they said, yes, I could come, but I would have to re-enlist and spend more time in it after. So, but anyway, for 2 years I worked in the psychiatric section as a ward keeper, what do you call it? Well, we was called bedpan commandos in those days, but we were dealing with patients who were, some were quite violent, but I learned a great deal in how to relate to people in a way that I guess we all learn over time, but it was very helpful to me that the psychiatrist and the staff was very helpful to me. So I appreciate that. One of the things that I did get out of the Army, I benefited from.
In thinking of kind of the progression of your career related to either working with either young people or youth, how did that come about?
Well, after I finished my master's degree, well, I had been interested in young people all the while, particularly around sports, and tried to do some coaching with basketball and things of that nature, and community centers and places where I lived in New York. And when I was in Denver in graduate school, I tried to coach some young people. But after I finished my master's degree and did an internship in Illinois, I took a position as a psychologist in a state institute, state training school for boys, a reformatory, as we called it. And that's what really got me involved, because we were assigned to different areas. And one of the things that I found out was that the staff needed a great deal of help in their ability to relate to the wards of the institution. And so I helped put together some training workshops for staff, particularly as it related to children, young people who had particular difficulty being exploited by others or being bullied, and those who were extremely, you might say, violent. So I moved on from there then and went to, I left Illinois and I went to California, and I took a position as a psychologist in one of the first major grants to provide training for mentally retarded adults leaving mental institutions, and helping them. Well, one of the things that I had to do was set up an assessment system of how to determine the skills of these young people or older people. Some of them were mature adults. The kind of skills that they had and what we could do to train them in other skills so that for employment. And that got me into the field of testing, even though we didn't use a great number of IQ tests in that situation. We developed work samples as a way of helping to understand people's physical and skills in various types of activities. In this program, we were training people to get jobs, and they would go out, our staff would go out and find different contracts to bring in that the young people could work on. And my job was to help find out the skills that they would have and how we could help them become more efficient workers.
So after you did that, my next kind of thought was about your relationship with the Association of Black Psychologists, and how did that begin, and then what were some of the main emphasis that they had?
After I received my doctorate, well, one of the things that I learned in the course of working with the mentally retarded and well as the physically disabled in rehabilitation was that everybody, well, there are some basic assumptions that you have to make about a test. And that is that the people who take the test have had an opportunity to experience the items or the kind of material they are being tested on. They also have to have an understanding of the language so they can understand the nature of the question, and they have to have the skills to communicate the responses that they're giving. And one of the things that I learned very clearly early in my profession, in my career, is that there are opportunities that many people have not had because of racism, because of economics, their backgrounds, and so they didn't have all the requirements that were necessary to make their experiences on a test valid. So that's where I began in that area. When I was in graduate school in Hawaii, I was a graduate teaching assistant, and I was one of the few people who had some experience. Well, I went for my doctorate after I had had about 8 years of working with a master's degree. And so I was one of the few people who had a lot of experience in working with tests. And so I was the graduate student who worked with almost all the testing courses. And one day I was walking around and graduate students were giving a whisk. And a young woman from the South was giving a whisk to he must have been 10 or 12, 11 or 10 years old, a Hawaiian child. And the question was, what would you do if you saw a train approaching a broken track? There are no trains in Hawaii.
Right.
And the fact that she had a very thick Southern accent came out something like, what would you do if you saw a train approaching a broken track? And I could see the wheels turning off around this poor kid's head, because he had no idea what she was talking about. But that was part of a test that you have to, in those days, you have to give to get people to give them a score. Another thing is, if you live on an island, there's only two sources of directions, toward the core, the mountains, or the sea. So if you ask a child, in what direction does the sun set, you always get the sea. But that's the wrong answer. And it's that kind of thing that made me become aware that there might be something to be concerned about when giving standardized tests to people whose backgrounds don't fit the requirements, shall we say, the middle class backgrounds that most tests are based on. So it was clear to me that we needed to do something about that, and those of us in San Francisco at the time those black psychologists, I should say, came together on occasions to deal with some of the issues in the community. One of the things that we did was work on getting the Oakland Police Department and fire, not the fire department, Oakland Civil Service Commission to recognize that the tests that they were giving were biased against minority applicants, and that they had to do something about changing the wording on tests so that they could hire more minority firefighters and police departments. Things like that we got involved with. And so in 1968, the APA met in San Francisco, and several of us who had been trying to get APA to move in the direction of recruiting more black psychologists and preparing them in graduate school. That's what I meant, getting more black students in graduate school, and responding to the issues of people doing research in the black community without the black community's benefit of the research. And so we continually went to APA to demand certain things without too much response from APA. And so in 1966, a number of us got together. I think there was about 40 some black psychologists. The word would get out, let's have a meeting at such and such a room at such and such a time. And we got together in August of 1968 and formed the Association of Black Psychologists. And with the goals, with our 5 goals that we placed, 3 of them I've already mentioned. The idea that the people were doing research in the black community and getting their benefit from publication, etc., but the black community wasn't getting any benefit. Second of all, there was the issue of the recruitment of students into psychology. Third, the mental health issues, that there were not enough mental health services in the black community, and we needed more. And so the concern about the, you might say, application of mental health programs and systems in minority communities. And the fourth was the standardized tests that were being used for education and employment policies were biased. At least we believed that. And the idea that there was a disproportionate representation of minority, of black men in prisons. So those are the 5 areas that we set out to address as a result of forming the Association of Black Psychologists.
I'm just contemplating a couple of things. One is the National Association of School Psychologists didn't get started until 1969. So at this time, you had many different people kind of doing school psychology and some showing up. At our meeting in CAS, for the CAS conference we had in Sacramento in 2013, there was a conversation about what had happened with the poor testing that was going on. And I love my school counselors because my aunt still thinks I'm a school counselor even though I'm a school psychologist. But school counselors were being trained over the summer to give IQ tests, and they weren't utilizing, over the summer. I said it that way. In like 1 week. So then they'd go out and give the test, and then they'd make their decision. So there wasn't a full breadth of knowledge along with that. So, and I'm hearing something new right now in regards to 1966. There was a pool of psychologists in San Francisco. Some of whom went to Berkeley, William Thomas,
Right.
Who spoke at CAS about 2 years ago. And so the reason why this conversation is so important, the Association of Black Psychologists and CAS had been on the other side of an issue, but hadn't been in the room to kind of discuss particular issues. So this is a pretty exciting moment, but I just learned something. So I see folks taking notes, so I'm looking forward to getting some more of those notes. Oh, boy. In moving forward, so since ABPSI started in '68, they've had some of these emphasis. What do you think is kind of the next thing that people, particularly students, should know about what ABPSI has done to move some things forward?
One of the things that I was involved in was the testing issue of IQ tests, the bias in IQ testing. And I was appointed to be the chairman of the psychology committee for ABPSI by the second, when we formed a committee, the second year we were in operation. And one of the things that we, as I said, our commitment was to do something about the bias in testing as it applies to schools. It just happened that some black parents in San Francisco had gone to the Urban League and was concerned about their children having been placed in classes for the mentally retarded, what they would call educable mentally retarded. There were 2 categories at that time, the trainable mentally retarded and the educable mentally retarded. The trainable were the more severely involved people, usually young people, usually with some physical disability associated with their mental functioning. And then the educable mentally retarded were people who scored poorly, below, from 1 to 2 standard deviations below the mean. And they were, the educational programs for these people were to make them more effective citizens. And academics was not the focus of the educable mentally retarded programs. And so these parents didn't believe their children were mentally retarded, and they went to this, to the Urban League, and the Urban League the president of the Urban League happened to know some of us, the black psychologists who had been involved in community activities around there. I mentioned the Oakland civil service exam. We also we were asked by a family whose child was being rejected for services by Kaiser Foundation Hospital because the nurse or the triage person felt that this child might have been molested. What happened was several small children were playing in the street playing in a yard or in a sidewalk in San Francisco, and one of the people who was board and care in a board and care home, who was out from a mental hospital at the time, heard these children laughing, and he assumed that they were laughing at him, and he went over and kicked one of these children. And her mother took her to Kaiser Foundation because her husband was a bus driver and was a member of Kaiser, and she was refused. She did go get mental services, but they felt they should have been served. So we, three other black psychologists and myself, went to Kaiser Foundation. We got an appointment with the board of directors at Kaiser and went to a meeting in Oakland at the Kaiser Foundation office. Big, beautiful conference room, mahogany, and one wall was all glass looking over the Bay Area. And so we sat down with these I think there were about 6 members of the board of directors, and we began talking. All of a sudden the door opened, and about 50 members of the Black Panthers walked in the room in their uniform, black jackets, looked like bandoleros, and they stood around the table, never said a word, just crossed their arms. Kaiser decided they would change their their policies at that point. But we were doing those kind of things. We weren't planning on this because we didn't even know that husband of the woman or the father of the child was a member of the Panthers. But we found out. But anyhow, those are the kind of things that I've been involved in.
Right.
And anyway, these parents who decided they didn't like to have their children being placed in classes for the educational retarded, we asked them. The Urban League called us, and we sat down with them, and we decided to start asking questions in the San Francisco School District. We found out that the requirement for getting a child placed in classes for the educational retarded was that they had to have a low score on an IQ test. And that we also found out that there was a disproportionate number of black children in special education EMR classes that was 3 times what one would expect based on the proportion of black students in the school districts. I think at that time there was about 20-some% of the students in San Francisco were black, and about 60-some% of the students in EMR classes were black. In the state of California at that time, I think 9% of the students in all the school districts were black. 9% were black, and 27% in special education EMR classes throughout the state of California were black. So this disproportion was what we were concerned about. We also found out that in order to get placed in the classes for the gifted, you had to take an IQ test and receive a score of a certain amount. And we found out that the opposite existed. There were very, very few black children in the classes for the gifted in comparison to their numbers in the school district. So it worked in one direction for the EMR classes and in the other direction for the gifted kids. In other words, something was happening with this testing situation to keep out gifted black kids and to put more children in the educational EMR programs. So we talked to the superintendent of San Francisco School District, and they said they could do nothing about that because these tests were required by the state of California. So we felt that it was time for us to go to deal with the state of California. Woodson Trials, a black educator, was the superintendent of schools for the state of California at the time. We thought we would have a brother who would be willing to listen to us. Unfortunately, that was not the case. We had more difficulty dealing with the State Department of Education than we did with San Francisco schools. We would have meetings, and it would, when I say we, there were two other psychologists who people don't give credit for, Dr. William Pierce and Dr. Gerald West. And the three of us would go to meetings, and we would, when we were going to our meetings, the California State Department committees, which there were frequently all new committees. When we would go, we would get another group of people that we had to sit and talk to. And then one of the things we used to kid ourselves about was to say, oh, we're going for our orals again. And that's what would happen. We had one guy who said he was retiring the next day, who was chairman of this committee. But so anyway, we did this for months. And we finally decided we would get publicity, and some lawyers, public advocates, law firm in San Francisco, decided to come along with us to help us. And they decided that the only thing left to do was to file a lawsuit. So several of us on a Saturday took 7 children whose parents had agreed, and we gave them standardized tests. One of these children, 2 of us saw and agreed that that child was appropriately placed. The other children increased their IQ scores from 17 to 34 points by us giving them. We did not vary the administration. We made it clear to the children that we knew they could answer these questions, and we're not trying to, you might say, find out anything wrong with them. And they increased their scores on an average of, well, it was from 17 points to 34 points in a standardized IQ test. And I must say that the California school psychologists decided that they would review our protocol. And of the 6 protocols, they found 3 points. And mine, one of my tests, they found 2 points. That's because I didn't write down the word 4. When you ask a child how many legs does a cow have, I just put down 4. I didn't write down 4. Or no, I just gave them a point instead of writing down 4. That was one of the kind of questions that they found that was wrong with our administration. So of all these 6 protocols, they found 3 points that was inappropriate. So anyway, so you know that I've had a history of positive relationships with California school psychologists. And I was glad to hear that when I met him, he was president. So things have changed quite a bit.
A bit.
So anyway, we decided to file a lawsuit. And the lawsuit was filed in, I think it was the day before Thanksgiving in 1971. And the judge issued a temporary injunction saying that we had a case that we should go to for a trial. That decision came down in June of the following year. It took us 7 years before we went to trial with appeals and other preliminary injunctions and this and that and the other. And so the trial started in October of 1977 or 1976 and went till May of 1977. And we had, well, I always remind people that we had 10,000 pages of testimony of all the people. The three of us, Bill Pierce, Jerry West, and I, were consultants to the lawyers throughout this whole process. And we sat in the trial, each of us, but we couldn't be sitting with the lawyers when one of us was testifying. But at the other times, the three of us sat with the lawyers throughout this case whenever we could. We all had jobs, but we would, whenever we could get off and go to sit with the trial, we went through this entire trial. The judge, in December of '79, the judge issued his decision saying that standardized tests of intelligence were culturally biased because they did not take into consideration the experiences and the background of African American children. They were not validated for the purpose for which they were being used. By the way, during the course of our effort, two laws were passed. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which says that Section 504 says that an instrument used in assessing handicapped individuals must be validated for the specific purpose for which it is used. And the Education for All Handicapped Children law was passed in 1975 that says tests should be selected and administered in a non-discriminatory fashion. And so those two laws had passed during the course of our work, and the judge said that the tests were not validated for the purpose for which they were used, and they were non-discriminatory. And his ruling was that he banned the use of IQ tests, standardized individual IQ tests on African American children being considered for special education placement in the state of California. I could go on and add it for night.
My census folks will have some other questions around that particular area, but I'm just kind of reflecting on a few things. One, the label MR during that time had some tremendous consequences.
Okay.
So the first thing is like sterilization was happening during that time, and California was the top state where people were sterilized, either within the prison system or in any other ways. So it had significant consequences. And it happened more recently. I think either 2011, 2012, similar things were happening within women's prisons. And someone reported about it, and then they have since stopped that practice. The Bay Area Association of Black Psychologists, for whatever reason, up and down the state, people bring that forward with a certain level of awe and reverence and sometimes fear because of what they were able to accomplish within those 7 years. Get this, 2 or 3 years after an organization starts, they effectively take on the state of California. That's some very direct action. You heard about the direct action with Kaiser. Right? And it makes me think about, Dr. Asa Hilliard wrote a piece with David Berliner, and they're two of the great educational psychologists of our age. And in their conversation about, it was more about what we do as school psychologists, educational psychologists. Are we going to focus on practice, or are we exclusively going to remain objective and focus on science? And Dr. Hilliard's point was, that is a decision. Your decision not to focus in on policy issues is a decision nonetheless, and it has impacts. So might as well move forward nonetheless. And so this is some of what I'm hearing in this story. This interesting thing about questioning Black capability, not just of the kids, because we kind of got that part, right? But of the psychologists themselves. So this is one thing I've learned. So they had you come up and they wanted to have a conversation with you again with bogus committees, which sometimes I've seen either in my work in schools, I've seen as somewhat of a tactic where people make up bizarre committees that no one's ever heard of, and they have you meet in these bizarre committees, and that's kind of that process of either discrimination or pushing someone out or moving someone along, but it works really well in a government bureaucracy. And it sounds like the California Department of Ed had their bureaucracy system down.
You mentioned Asa Hilliard. I just want to make a point.
Yeah.
We had many people to testify during the trial. One of them was Asa Hilliard. The question, well, what we did was we tried to refute every response that the state would give to justify their placement of students in special education. One of them was, as we said, the cultural issues that were not dealt with in any of the items on the test. And there was a sociologist from Johns Hopkins who testifies for the state of California who said there was no such thing as the black experience. In Judge Peckham's decision, Asa Hilliard was, I think, on the witness stand for 2 days. And in Judge Peckham's brief at the end, he says, Dr. Hilliard introduced the court to the black experience. I just had to, I think, very, very appropriate kind of response from a judge.
If you're familiar with his writing, particularly the book Maroon, The Maroon Within Us, he spends the first 2 or 3 chapters talking about what the core and context and texture of the black experience. And so I was telling Brian earlier, I read that book here when I was a student here at San Diego State. So yeah. There was an interesting point. I just added like another note here. The lawsuit was filed a month before my birth. So it's one of those things that kind of helps me remember those different things. I'm curious as to what kept you going during those 7 years.
The fact, our belief that we were right, and the fact that we were getting positive reactions from the black community. Well, let me put it this way. We were not welcomed in a lot of places, but it happened that frequently we would be asked to make presentations at APA and other psychological and sociological organizations. However, after the trial and the decision was rendered, we didn't get any more invitations. We won the case, but they didn't want to find out what we did. They wanted to challenge us at all these meetings, and it was interesting. It was very appropriate. I just want to point out a couple of other things. What we did was, and I don't want to take up too much time, but
we're doing good on time.
We were trying to point out everything that they used to justify the placement of kids in special education. They said that kids would come to school hungry and therefore they couldn't think properly. We had a black psychiatrist who had done some research in Africa, and she found out that she said that nothing in this country could compare with the profound, prolonged hunger that children experienced in Africa, and that is why they could not use that as an excuse for saying children came to school hungry. Their life experiences were never so severe as the children in Africa who had to have profound and prolonged periods of hunger in order to function, or in order to be their functioning to be effective. The other thing is they said that there was a law in California that every child should, the records of each child they should have social information, medical information, academic information, and a psychological assessment. And that the assessment should coordinate, or not coordinate, confirm all the other behavioral indices. We did a study, and we didn't do a study. There was a study that it was reported in the trial that the state had paid an organization to evaluate records in San Francisco. They found out that 25% of those records had social information. 48% had medical information. 60-something had academic information. 99% had IQ scores. But the IQ score was not the major issue, according to the state. Things like that we continually refuted. The APA had come out with an analysis of why you could, in Psych 101, we all get the information. You shouldn't make a test for one population and then apply it to another. But this is what they were doing. Jane Mercer had the APA came out with a report from a committee of psychologists that a test could be applied to two groups if you had correlation coefficients between a grade point average and an IQ test, which was similar between these two populations, and that if you took the regression line from from scores from each of these two populations, the regression lines would be parallel, and that the regression lines for these distributions the angles would be the same for the random error and the constant error. Jane Mercer had done some work, and she had scores from, I think, one school district here in Southern California of about 1,200 kids. I'm sorry I didn't have material. They were in my briefcase, and
That's all right.
Brandon had a difficult time parking, so I didn't want to go to get stuff out of my trunk.
State school, gotta live.
The correlation coefficient for white students between grade point averages and IQ score was 0.46. The correlation coefficient for African American students at grade point average was 0.22. The regression lines were not parallel, and in fact they crossed somewhere in the early part of the distributions. And I think this is the kind of things that convinced the judge that we were on the right track, that these tests were inappropriately applied to African American students. So much for the Larry P. case.
I was also curious about jury selection experience.
Oh.
So talked with you earlier as well.
I have to
You
say,
mentioned that earlier.
I've been a maverick of a psychologist. I have been involved in a lot of things. One of the things was that a graduate student of Bill Pierce was from Atlanta, Georgia, and she was a close friend of the lawyer who was a lawyer for Angela Davis. And this lawyer had been a classmate of another lawyer. I can't remember his name, but he had done the Shepard case, which was a case of a doctor who was accused of killing his wife, and he had brought in psychologists to help in jury selection. So Howard Moore decided he would look up some black psychologists, and so again, the four of us went and worked with Howard Moore and his law group. We visited Angela Davis while she was in jail, and we worked for about 6 weeks. No, a little less than that in jury selection. What we tried to do was help lawyers learn how to ask questions that didn't require yes or no answers. See, lawyers want you to respond very specifically to their kinds of questions. But in order for us to get some feeling or understanding of how these people would relate to other people and how they could perceive a very brilliant black woman who was accused of helping the Black Panthers, we wanted to get some idea. So we had to get them to ask questions that would allow people to talk so we could understand a little bit about their attitudes and We also observe them in I can't remember the legal name for when they sit in the jury, doing pre-examinations, voir dire, something to that nature, where people related to one another or didn't relate or looked at one another and this sort of thing. And again, we were accused after the jury freed Angela Davis that we selected only the people who we knew would be right, which was by no means the case. We'd select them based on, one, their belief that the system could work in cases such as this exceptional situation, and that they were people who made their own decisions rather than relied on the decisions of others. There are lots of others. We have an article that's in that when the Journal of Black Psychology first came out. That was one of the first articles we put in.
So you mentioned the Journal of Black Psychology. That's just a plug. If you're thinking about these kinds of issues as well, and I know your library has access to it if you're a student here at San Diego State, and if not, there's definitely archives of the Journal of Black Psychology, or what's called the newsletter, or the news journal, which is Psych Discourse for the Association of Black Psychologists, and they have many different articles. So sometimes when I'm even looking up historical articles about some of these events that have happened, the newsletters are just as good. You have the CAST newsletters as well. Just a commercial here for the California Association of School Psychologists. We have a Larry P. archive that's available online. And if you contact the CAST office directly, they'll help you with it. But I know there was a link on our website. So a little commercial break there. No, another question. You've addressed some of this a bit, and I'm kind of I'll add those together. You were talking about what students and practitioners should know about standardized assessment and other types of assessment. And I'm also thinking about mediated learning and dynamic assessment. And so I'm kind of posing that because I first want to ask you, what's your relationship with Dr. Reuven Feuerstein? If you can tell us about that relationship.
Fantastic man. I don't know if you know much about Reuven Feuerstein, but he started his work working with children who came to Israel from all over the world immediately after World War II. They didn't have the same language. They had tremendous differences in life experiences, and over the years he worked to try to determine their assessment. And immediately after the Larry P. case, myself and another psychologist was asked if we would help them develop an assessment procedure that did not involve standardized tests. And one of the things that we were always asked when we were being challenged by at these organizational meetings that we've been invited to, people would ask us, what are you going to do if you take away our WIS? Well, our response was that we should be concerned about how the child functioned, how his cognitive skills functioned and how they used them. And this is, it's not that simple, but this is what Feuerstein did, working with children to help them understand or to find out how they processed information and how they took in information, took in a stimulus, and what they did with it. And formulated his whole approach of the structural cognitive modifiability of one's system. In other words, how, in his system, you work with a child and you let the child know that you want to help that child put forth their best effort. And this is what he refers to as intentionality. And you want to find out how willing this individual is to receive your help, the reciprocity and the ability this will help you determine how much you can really effectively help that child learn how to learn. And when we were working to try to develop a system of assessment for the San Francisco schools, the other psychologist, I can't remember his name, my Alzheimer's kicks in every once in a while. He had been acquainted, what happened was, in 1980, I was asked to come to a meeting in Yale, and I received a book in the mail called The Mentally Retarded Performer, LPAD, I forget the name of the book, but Feuerstein's first book, in which he described his assessment procedure. And I opened the book up, and one of the chapters was cultural deprivation. And I said, another white man's going to tell me I'm culturally deprived. So I put the book away. Asa Hilliard went to the meeting. He was sent a book, and when he came back, he told me that was not the case. Feuerstein's approach is that when a child has not had mediated learning experiences with a caregiver who communicates and informs that child of his or her culture, when a child does not have that opportunity, he or she is culturally deprived of his own culture. Not that there is a standard culture. And that to me was the thing that sold me on Feuerstein. We asked Feuerstein to come over, and when we had designed this program with his approach as the basis, he came over and attended one of our training sessions. And that was in, I can't remember, in 1984 or 5. But since then, I have tried to convert school districts all over California with dynamic assessment approaches. LA, Compton, Sacramento, Del Paso Heights, and San Francisco. I had workshops in all these with trying to expose Feuerstein's approach, and I have not been doing the training, but would get someone of Mons Jensen usually to come in and do the training for the school psychologists. One of the things that I guess is frustrating for me is that psychologists have a tremendous amount of resistance of learning something new. Because Feuerstein's approach is so different, he begins with the whole statement, the statement that every child can learn, and it's our responsibility to find out how we can accomplish this. Too many psychologists feel that they have learned a way, and it's much more difficult for them to learn a new style. And I've tried this in many school districts along the way. Teachers respond to Feuerstein's approach much more quickly than do professional psychologists. But I went to Israel, and I've taken every level of Feuerstein's training, and I've met him at many of his conferences, and feel that he was a tremendous individual to take. Well, it's been all his life developing this approach, and I was very honored when he was being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I received an email from an Italian professor who said that Feuerstein had asked if he contacted me and asked me to write a letter of recommendation for his nomination. I was very, very impressed.
Yeah, that's actually a good spot for you to clap because I'm hoping y'all will get involved. So at this time I wanted to open up for any questions that you may have. If you can, maybe write down a note about your question, because when I edit the video I want to make sure I got that question in there just right. But if anyone has any questions, maybe we can pause for a moment if you want to write it down, or if you're ready. Yeah. Yes.
Well, given the fact that new IQ tests have better norms, and the focus is more on neurological processing, and the processing of information is what the primary focus is on, and the interventions that go with that, how do you feel about proposing that laws change so that we can, in fact, test African American students?
I'm not too sure I understand your question in terms of the physiological aspects of it. There is no requirement in Feuerstein's approach that indicates the physiological processes. He deals with the cognitive way of incorporating information,
Problem. Yeah.
which does not necessarily. He recognizes that there are limitations that physical problems can impose on one's ability, but he does not require physiological, shall we say, treatment or recognition of impairment, physiological impairment in his approach. What we try to do is move people along, well, using the test-teach-test to help a child learn how to analyze a problem and find ways of utilizing it in his own problem solving. And I'm not too sure that physiological issues are involved from my point of view, but the whole concept, well, there's been research that the test-teach-test correlating this post-test performance has always been more accurate description of the person rather than the pre-test or the single testing situation. And by giving the cues or, I might say, methods of helping that child understand the nature of the problem, well, I can use, I see some of the tasks, and I can talk about how to help the child understand a complex design, for example, by understanding what that design is made up of: compartments, rectangles, circles, triangles, angles, and connections. He can begin to he memorizes that more quickly by understanding these relationships. And I don't see the physiological. It just takes some people longer to do that, and that's what we call the it'll come to me. You can understand the length of effort you have to put out in order to get that child to move along continual learning. And that can be something that teachers need to use in classrooms. They can recognize how much effort it takes for a child to learn. Some children, you do it very quickly, others it takes an awful lot of time. But the understanding is that it can be done, and it takes our patience and ability and willingness to help him make that movement. And I'm not sure that addresses your question.
Well, I think the effort is that currently trying to link good intervention practices by understanding what process the student
Yes.
is taking. So I think the intention is the same. It sounds like it's just a different theoretical model. They're coming from a brain-based point of view, and I think
It's a tremendously different theoretical process, and that's what causes the resistance, I believe, with many people. They have already learned how to give a brisk whisk, as we used to say.
But I think a lot of people don't necessarily give it
Yes.
with that neurological processing approach in mind either.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's better not to open it up just yet to testing African American students or students of color with the
Well-
standardized test or people of different cultures until people are well grounded in it. And maybe it's not.
I heard two parts, and
Okay.
forgive me
Sorry,
if
I
you
don't
will.
mean-
No, I think there's information that's come out from the California Diagnostic Center North. Okay, and they put together a handbook for best practices and assessment for African American youth. And in that handbook addresses many things you're talking about. So first, the pattern of strengths and weaknesses that's come out of federal regulations and that type of conversation. They don't necessarily call it that, but that's exactly what they're doing. They call it the matrix. And within that matrix, they're looking for different types of functions, which gives some overlap to what we're talking here. It's not all 72. So Freudstein has 72 different functions. I think this is the hardest part about learning the whole Freudstein process, in that you have to chunk and get to know those 72 different functions. And that comes with practice in working and doing those kinds of assessments. But going back to the Diagnostic Center North, and James Hiramoto does presentations up and down the state regarding this. He talks about sampling size, which has changed partly because of the kind of efforts that the Association of Black Psychologists posed. Said, look, you're not sampling who you need to sample in order to address this issue.
Right.
Similarly, like there's some whisks that were being given in a very large county here in California. And what they were doing was taking the English version of the whisk and translating it, into Spanish, and then giving it to students and still storing it.
Diana case, right.
Similar types of issues, even after the Diana case. So I even had to report a couple of folks in a county that I may or may not have worked in. I'm just saying. But folks not taking into account those kinds of things before they pick up an assessment tool. My concern has been that folks could start giving those standardized tests. They can show a couple things. First piece is that they've addressed overrepresentation in a way that's effective, because that's why people kept losing court cases. and the Association of Black Psychologists kept winning because they kept saying, you're not addressing the actual issues that are going on here. Either you're under-identifying or over-identifying, but you're not actually addressing what's happening with that child. So a very thorough assessment would be important. I think concern overall throughout the state is, one, we don't have continuing education units for school psychologists. So going back to this resistance that Dr. Dent's talking about, if you don't have continuing education units, people don't grow. And they get stuck on very particular administrative priorities when it comes to training. So training around things like culture and diversity, which was a requirement that came out of conversations with the Association of Black Psychologists, Larry P. Task Force, those kinds of things. That's no longer required, and quietly just went away. But in that process, people don't go to update their training around these issues. So we can't get the synergy that we need to have a good conversation about neuropsychology, to have a good conversation about mediated learning, to have a good conversation overall about culture and diversity and the changing demographics of every last neighborhood here in not just California, but throughout the country when it comes to gentrification and other things, and what that does to sampling size and all those other pieces. Yeah, I'm going a little crazy, but you can see kind of where we're at. So yes. I'm with a couple of folks who, and I don't want to put them out there, but people who I've talked to within the state, they're concerned that the Larry P. test ban stay in place only until people start coming up with something different. Yes. So the other thing I think that school districts must do is begin to talk with black parents. Right? Yeah, I'm just looking at what the winning side did. The members of the Association of Black Psychologists heard black parents out. That doesn't happen in many different places, in large efforts, or seeking people out to get a sense of what your experience is like with just a basic question. I'm going to be doing some of this research in the spring here. Trying to get through IRB at a university is fun. But the basic question of what is your experience like sending your kid to school with special education, with any other mental health kind of service? By and large, we don't have good information about that. Any parent, let alone, and particularly black parents, we don't have good information about that. And CASP hasn't gone out of their way to do that. They've gone out of their way to talk to black parents who want IQ tests. And those are generally friends who they went to PhD school with. I looked in the archive, saw the letters. So we just have not made that effort. So this conversation we're having is a part of moving towards that effort. So I'm asking y'all, when you're out and about, start posing some of these questions. What is the experience of black families like? Now, within that context, this tool that I'm about to use, how does that work? And I think that's a lot of what I'm getting out of what Dr. Dent is saying as well.
I just want to add one other thing to what you're saying. One of the things that I did when I was in the Berkeley school system is to set up a storefront office in the black community with a counselor and a psychologist or a social worker to meet with parents whenever and they had the time in, as I said, a storefront. Because what we used to say is train parents how to hustle the system, how to communicate and learn how to interact with the school system so that you can be a better advocate for your child. And that's what I hear you, the kind of thing that we did, yes.
It's interesting that you might say that, Dr. Dent, because we have an organization in San Diego called the Harmonious Solutions that was funded by the state to do that exact thing, and also to work with mental health issues in the African American and African community. And they were so successful that the state defunded them, and now they're a struggling organization.
Yeah, principals didn't like what I did either.
I remember there was two parts to the ruling. One was that the tests were being used in a discriminatory manner, and the other issue was that they were going to dead-end classes. Would that still be in the case? Do you, especially with the recent release of the SBAC results and seeing that there's still a big, discrepancy between those who have and those who do not have, do you see that special ed still being a dead-end, program? Is that even something that we should be thinking about? Should we be thinking about changing categorical special ed, altogether, to just focus on, the major disabilities as opposed to the soft disabilities, where children end up just going one way? They're in RSP, then SDC, then they're on drugs, and the whole nine. So
It's my opinion is that we should do whatever we can to educate people, not to train them into becoming good citizens in that respect. As I mentioned earlier, the thing about Feuerstein's work is that they believe every child can learn, and it's up to us to develop the techniques and the approaches, and his is a good one, to help people learn more effectively, to learn how they learn. One of the things that I always use as an example, many years ago during Christmas time, my grandson, people were taking pictures of everybody, each other. And later on that afternoon, I picked up a camera and pointed it at him, and he said, no. I said, what do you mean? And he told me to take the cap off the... And I said to him, well, how did you learn that? He said, I watched. He learns by watching, and we can help young people learn, find out how they can learn more effectively. And so I have a strong belief that we need to train more people how to use, and parents as well as professionals, how to work with children in the opening and developing those cognitive skills. And as I said, one of the things that I feel strongly about is helping parents become better advocates for their children.
I don't know if you answered this or not. I'm trying to find my way here. But,
Can you speak a little louder, please?
I'm sorry. I said I don't know if you answered this question or not because I just got here. My situation is my son is biracial. He's Vietnamese and black, and I really had to fight the school to get him help because he was struggling, and he has attention problems. So he's diagnosed with ADD, and I didn't know anything about the IQ test. It came up during the conversation with the psychologist. She changed his ethnicity from Asian American to African American. I asked her to change it. She said that she couldn't. And so she said I had to do it through the system. So I went to the system and I told them take out African American, put in Asian American, because I wanted him to be able to get any benefits. And I didn't want him being black to hinder him. And the psychologist still told me that because she knew that he was half black, she couldn't give him an IQ test, which then made me feel like we were being discriminated against. And she told me about Larry P. And that made me upset because I said, well, I didn't vote on any of this. I want my son to be treated like every other kid.
I suggest you get a lawyer. No, I'm not trying to be, because it's their responsibility to provide your child with whatever he needs. If they don't have it, you have a right to get them to pay to get it done. So this is part of my concern about advocacy. Don't let them tell you what they have and that's all you can get. There's a law that says they have to pay for whatever your child needs. And if she doesn't, well, once you get a lawyer, she'll tell you something differently. Let's put it that way. Because this is really, we had a situation like that with the, right after Larry P. Case. And I even wrote to the mother and parent and said that we in the Association of Black Psychologists would help her get an assessment. She was being manipulated, I think, by some conservative organization, and they were trying to fight the whole Larry P. case. But I suggest that she ask, there are law firms that will do both pro bono work, or law organizations in South. I don't know what exists here, but there was a Public Advocates was the name of a law group in San Francisco. There may be other kinds of law groups in this area.
Children's Alliance Incorporated is
Okay.
one. I know of in the LA area, but I don't know if they're down here, but I'm sure they take the case, because I know there's precedent. So if whatever you've listed your child's ethnicity on the first set of paperwork you did with the school district, that's the precedent that's set, and the school district needs to follow that. And there's been a court case. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't pull out the court case out of my hat, but I know that's part of the precedent.
Well, it puts me, I don't want to single out any race, and I don't feel that I should have to. But in order to get him services, that's what I had to do. But now on top of it, they're saying they're not going to give me any more services.
As I said, as soon as you tell them you're getting a lawyer, they'll change the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, they will. The services are the big issue. You're getting what you need for your child. And what I find is that this is how discrimination works. You mentioned kind of the issues that are happening currently in regards to classes. So in Los Angeles, there is a consent decree. So in that consent decree allowed us to kind of unpack what happens when school districts don't follow through on quality service. Because I think a large part of the issue is that there's an approach avoidance. Well, because there's this test ban, I can only do what I can do, and it's kind of weak. what's being done, rather than very straightforward and quality and thorough work. So in this very large school district here in Southern California where the Dodgers play, this very large school district where the consent decree went down, it's all on their website, so I'm not putting them out there, but and I think it was hard for a lot of folks who work for the school district to kind of hear these things had happened, but this is exactly what happened. They went through and found out that they were placing African American students too frequently in what's called classes for students with emotional disturbance. Now, we've heard of that part. Here's the part that they dug in underneath and found, is that when they were placing them, here's the quality issue. When they placed them, they didn't have psych reports. They had just checked a box at magically ED. Okay. They didn't have a behavior support plan to follow up on that. That was a huge problem. And then they, what else? No goals, and then no counseling. So they said you have an emotional problem, have a nice life, and didn't add anything else to it. So my concern always is, generally, it's with discrimination, it's inconsistently applied policy. And when people make up subjective policy, they kind of, bad things happen, even though they may not intentionally be out to do something wrong. Bad things tend to happen, and so large groups of folks who don't have the access to advocate for themselves. So it sounds like there's a group here, or at least represented, if you're in the San Diego area at least, that you can definitely connect with before we go.
Well, we found out, actually,
Got
that
3 questions.
Compton sits on one side of the street, LA is on another side of the street. LA has a staff of pupil personnel services. At least when we were there, Compton didn't have a full set of staff. When you have a child who was assessed in Compton, they didn't have a speech program or emotional program for the emotionally disturbed, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody had learning disability. When you were in Compton, in LA, children get speech problems, emotional disturbance, mental retardation, all these services that are available for in LA. In other words, you get what the school has, and you get diagnosed according to what the school has available for you. But if you need help and have services available who can speak for you, you will get services that your child needs, not what they have.
Yes.
I worked in Compton for 5 years, and still not aware of all the problems that black people have. Being a white honky there, I had my own set of problems. But I'm out of that now. I'm an LEP and I have a private practice. And I had it happen in Compton, where I was not allowed to give Wexler for any reason, which I always asked the question, well, okay, if they're already in special education, well then can I test them using the Wexler, because it's highly diagnostic, especially the Woodcock-Johnson, so I can try and get an idea of what's going on. And if I could take just a few minutes to tell you 2 anecdotal stories of my experience. I had a grandfather come in, a nice elderly gentleman, looks a little bit like you, but he was a little older. And he said, Mike, I just got custody of my grandson. And he went to school here, he was in some special classes, I really don't understand. He moved to Texas, and he came back with all this material from the school. Well, Texas had done a wonderful job. They had him placed all the way to 22 and beyond. The boy was mentally retarded. Okay, today it's intellectual disability. Well, I wasn't even allowed to look at those scores, So, and this is why a lot of kids wind up in special education. People in special education want to get them help under any guise at all. They just want to, this kid needs help. Well, I dummied up a report and sent him over to the regional center and referred him to Social Security. Some months later, he came back in, he got his first Social Security check for this boy, and the boy was getting some services from the regional center. When I had my private practice, I just started, and somebody referred me to a young black child, young black man, who had been through the entire educational system someplace in the Inland Empire, and he was living on the streets. And they said, can you do something? I did. I got him to Social Security, got him into the regional center, Department of Rehabilitation, and got him a place to live. He's off the streets. But all this came about because in a school system, if you look at the federal requirements for getting Social Security, you have to have an IQ test. You know, and you have to have a lot of other things along with it, adaptive skills and so on and so forth. So I think it's really harmed the black community in many ways, and I think there has to be alternatives to get the students that need to help into those classrooms that can help them. And maybe you would know, the Wexler has, what, a couple hundred items on? Certainly all of them are not racially biased. How many items on that IQ test are racially biased? And can we just throw them out and still use the
Well,
diagnostic portions of the test?
From my point of view, you as an individual can do far more, and you probably have, than a score. The score is the thing that influences people in terms of the programs and the services. You have probably gone out of your way to provide them with what the child or the person needs. There aren't too many people who are available to do that. And I'm not trying to put school psychologists or other clinicians down. One of the things that we did when I was running an internship program was have criteria that one of the things that the clinician must know is what services are available in the community other than the kind that he or she is providing to help that person along the way. And I'm certain that you work that way, but there are many people who can't or don't function that way.
That's why I'm not working for the districts anymore. I
So-
can do as I damn well please.
So I would add one other piece. I worked in a school district where they treated every kid as if they were African American, so they didn't use the Wexler or the Woodcock Johnson unless they got sued. Then they used it, which was interesting. They felt they were so diverse, that kind of thing. The other thing is when IDEA 97 changed, they stopped doing a full assessment if they had all the information they needed from the prior assessments. And so we ran into an issue with the Department of Mental Health. So back then it was AB 3632, now it's AB 114, and the students had to be eligible in utilizing some type of cognitive measure. So it was interesting to me, it didn't matter what we used, it mattered that we had a score. So I could have made up my own test and put a score to it, and they would have been satisfied with it, provided what they needed to do to provide the service. So I was also wondering, like, what changed? What's dynamically going to change, being that I give you a laundry list of things that this child's going through for these mental health services at this point. I think also that we run into a challenge in that if we're looking at broader populations and we only take a few anecdotes, that's not necessarily going to influence the broader policy and the broader issue. And going back, I think what both the parent has raised and what you've raised is about access to high quality services. So, but when we advocate only for ourselves, that's the losing strategy in the state of California for the past 40 years. The parents need to be able to advocate for what they need, and we need to be able to advocate for the parents getting the quality service, because if we advocate for what we want, nobody cares. We're like that much of the school district, and our power is very limited. Most places, we're not even in a union. So I get why you would step outside. I left the school district as well for similar type of broad policy issues where you felt kind of crunched under. But I still work for the state, which drives me crazy. So yeah, I think we can do both. I think we can both advocate for parents very directly, but also advocate for broader policy change. And so if there were a whole population that's struggling with emotional disturbance, you'd think there'd be a whole marshaling of resources to support those students. If there's a whole population that's struggling with ID, you think there'd be a whole marshal of resources. That's beyond what we can do with the test kit. That's us making connections with people beyond school psychologists. So just a quick show of hands. How many people do we have other than school psychologists here in this room? Yeah.
Psychologist and something else.
Yeah, right. School psychology is something else. And so most of us are trained as school psychologists, so we need to all leave and have a conversation with people who influence a lot of these policies, because many of them they have no clue what we do. I've worked with people in schools. I worked with one school for 8 years, and the principal still didn't know what the heck I did, other than you get to go to lunch, and I don't. That was kind of his concern. I think we had a question here, a question there, and then another over here.
This gentleman.
Yeah.
I suppose mine is kind of end of the road kind of question, and just kind of putting it in the context of some of what we've talked about here, and kind of maybe the driving reasons behind the movement that you began was for the purposes of keeping ethnically diverse groups from being marginalized, and now listening to some of the problems that some of the other people have brought up, and just I kind of reflect that I've seen some of the same thing, that sometimes it seems that there might be inadvertently some marginalization still going on. So for young professionals like myself and others here, what is your hope of what maybe that end of the road kind of thing would be? What do you want this to be driven to look like one day?
People think I'm crazy, but one of the things that I feel is we've got to fight to get politicians to understand that if they can spend millions of dollars on elections, campaigns, and the military, and then say we're spending too much money on our children, that we need different kind of politicians. And one of the things that I want to do, again, is help parents recognize that they have a responsibility to vote for the kind of people who are going to help them rather than deal with other issues. And not be intimidated by people who can speak louder or more, unfortunately, I don't know how to say it, but recognize that if they could spend all this money doing what other people think is right, what about their children? We have to help this country understand that children are the most important thing, rather than elections or what have you. But that's just a crazy idea of mine. But I would love to see us be willing to train people in a way that benefits children rather than the system. And I have to say that I think Feuerstein's approach, and I'm not trying to denigrate any other system, Feuerstein's approach, in my opinion, is the best thing that we have available, and that we shouldn't limit the ability of people who want to function effectively by saying that they can only spend a half an hour giving a kid an assessment. As I said, I used to get mad at brisk whisk is all that this kid needs. That's not the case.
So your hope
If
is
you
for-
want to help somebody, you've got to understand how they function, and you can't do it in an hour and a half.
Your hope is for an overarching, completely different assessment approach.
And I think teachers should get the same appreciation and opportunity to do what they really can do.
Don't miss this part. It's not just the assessment approach. It really doesn't matter. They change every 5-10 years. You have to completely redo what they're doing, or they come out with a whole new set. You know,
Oh, yeah.
Woodcock Johnson just changed. I know people went through changes. They had to come and pry my purple beast for me back during, I think, like the second to the third edition. I was really stuck to that thing because I got a lot of good diagnostic stuff out of it. So, and I think it was talking about before, that resistance we have to change. the policy issues to deal. We got to make friends beyond just right in front of us with the building and those who flip pages. One thing underneath that subtext is in regards to testing and broader policy issues. Testing is like big pharma. There's only so many of them. The people who made the test, there are about 5 people. They all went to school together, they all sat together and ate dinner at the foot of Wexler, Camp House, Kaufman, Naglari. They all hung out. And they all developed a billion-dollar system to tell us exactly what we need to do. Now, my challenge is for folks to pose different types of questions as well. Sure, utilize those things. I mean, we all have access to them. Utilize them in the best way you can. If I got something from Texas, it used to tick me off, like we had to mark it out and all that other stuff. It's good info, right? But then put it within the proper context of what it's needed. So I hope you're hearing, it's what you have now, providing a quality intent. So intentionality, reciprocity, that becomes a lifestyle too. That becomes a part of what goes on. So I just saw you do something. You connected with the parent, right? The person right in front of you, he connected with the parent. That's what brings about change. If we get stuck behind that test kit, flipping pages, now it's even on the thing, right? if we get stuck in that process, we'll miss out on the whole big world. So, and I'm keeping track of the questions here. So we have one over here, and then one back here. So yes, all in the back. And the baby too, thank you.
I'm actually a new school psychologist in
All right.
my first year of employment, second career. And I think one of the things that I've noticed going through my training and doing my internship is a lot of the tests are only as good as the integrity we have when we give the test, and also understanding both the strengths and the drawbacks of the test, because there's no such thing as a perfect assessment tool.
No.
That said, I'd like to hear your input on a new, probably not new, but newer struggle that we have, and that's that we've addressed the issue of the African Americans through law anyway with Larry P. But our new struggle is the newcomers that we're getting. Do you have any advice from what you've learned through your experience with the African American population on ways that I can better assess my newcomers so that I'm not either not giving them services because I don't feel like I can assess them yet, or giving them services when they really shouldn't be in special education?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. So you're talking about students who are coming from another country?
Primarily Middle Eastern.
Okay, so Middle Eastern immigrants
And
coming,
African.
and
South
African
African.
immigrants.
I think it's South African.
Sudanese, Somali,
Yes.
So we're talking here in San Diego area.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely Sudanese, Somali. Great documentary on PBS about the Sudanese
I'm
folks
working in a
coming.
high school that's got a lot of newcomers from Africa and the Middle East.
Okay.
And so I want to make sure I'm.
So I'm pulling a bit from what Dr. Dent talked about. Okay, and there's an article in NAS came out a few years ago on mental health. I was just looking at it because I was writing the thing. It's by Dr. Harold Stevenson, and he talks about the conspicuous invisibility of black ways of being. All right, that's the title of the article. So it's kind of provocative, and I think he wrote it in that way because it was a commentary. And his commentary was that quite often we miss out on hearing what people are giving us. Like I said, it's broader than us. We only have these assessment tools, only gives us so much information. So, like Dr. Dent's model he was talking about when he was director of people services in Berkeley, have opportunities to hear parents and where they're coming from. Because some of that is a bit of anthropological work. It's a public health model. Dr. Terry Gutkin talks about that he's up at Cal State San Francisco. And he talks about school psychologists need to be involved in a public health model, looking more broadly at the trends of who's coming into the building. So a couple of the ways that I've done that over the years is I keep track of every referral that I have and look at what are the issues that people are being referred for. I also keep a group, and this is what Dr. Stevenson talked about in his article. And this is coming, I'm seeing this more and more, and Dr. Dent was really confirming that this is a good practice here. You get to know those parents, but you have a group of people who are fans of what you do. And sometimes they're critics too, and they'll give you a hard time about, well, this doesn't work. You're about to go and roll this type of program out, or you're doing your assessments in this way, and this isn't connecting with what we do. So I would start there, surveying, and what I mean by survey, broadly get to know those folks, and then systematically take a look at how you're connecting with that group, and then you'll come across some ways to ask better questions, to connect with cultural brokers, as it were, right? So particularly around translation of terms, direct translation, around the administration of the assessments that you have, and you'll make those connections. It may take a little bit because it's dynamic, but once you set that in place, you'll at least be up with the game. Right now, if you don't have that kind of system in place, you're always going to be playing catch up because there's always going to be a new group. Right now, and all across America, I mentioned gentrification before. We're going through this whole phase where neighborhoods are changing rapidly. And they're still building stuff. I can't believe this building I'm sitting in right now. They're constantly building stuff, and folks are coming in and moving out and coming in, and we're having more and more with this bullet train that they're proposing here in California in the next few years. By the time that baby's a school psychologist, I can't imagine what kind of questions we'll be asking about people coming back and forth and those kind of things. I would also, again, refer you to the handbook from the California Diagnostic Center and what it does, taking a look at sampling size and also different areas, domains to begin to look at. So, yeah. All right.
This gentleman over here.
She had a question, and then he was.
I really don't have a question anymore. I was going to tell my little story to advocate for some of the things that you were already saying, but I think it's been said and advocated enough for, and I'll just listen.
That's it? Okay.
I was interested in Feuerstein. I haven't looked at that book in 35 years. So I can only remember one little thing which I think you touched on, so it helps me remember what I think I remember. It's the kind of a thing where he had different types of problems. A lot of them were visual problems. And he starts off easy, and you have to learn how to get to the next level,
Right.
and so forth. Visual patterns and what comes next, I'm not sure. Anyhow, so that's a big part of his philosophy and thinking, right? How everybody could learn. You can learn this, then you go to the next step, learn this, and the next step, and so on and so on. Right? Am I got it right?
Yes.
Okay. Now I'm thinking about the WISC. Now I would say block design. It starts out very easy. I'll say anybody could do it. They'll put two blocks together, red and a white. But then the next design is a little bit harder. And so as you're doing it, you're also learning how to do the next more difficult, challenging block design on the WISC, whatever. Right? And a few other subtests are like that on the Wechsler.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, but very likely that many of the Wechsler tests would be not culturally inhibited or messed up or something. There's some valuable subtests on the Wechsler because you start off very simple, even if it's similarities. Dog, cat. Like I got a hunch, your culture, your ethnic group knows dog, cat. Then it becomes piano, violin, and this and that, and that might be a big jump. They kind of gradate it from simple to harder, until like I don't know how to do them. And so I'm wondering with your somewhat negative thinking about the standardized tests, the nature of the Wechsler, if you're throwing out the baby with the wash or something like that with the Wechsler. In other words, it's just not a difficult subtest. Starts off easy, a little harder, and there's several other, maybe at least half of the subtests on the Wechsler that go the same way. It starts off easy, so you know what it is, and it's paralleling from what you just said Feuerstein does. Starts off easy, gets harder, and so does the Wechsler. So I don't know.
Well, the one thing that is so important about Feuerstein is that he talks about things that are in relation to the culture of the child, that that he's working with. In other words, the language that you use to describe things comes from his culture. One of the things that I've always wanted to do is take items from the Feuerstein approach and put it in a context of American Indians or black families and see how it relates, how effective the child learns more quickly from culturally related issues or things than the standardized things. And I'm not trying to say everything in the West should be thrown out. I'm saying that the approach of helping a child understand his cultural functioning and how he can learn how to solve a problem his way, and then move it on to greater and larger problems. And one of the things that we talk about with Feuerstein's approach is stop and think. Do I understand what I'm asked to do? Do I have all the information that I need? And is there something that I have done before that would relate to what I'm doing now? And keep putting things in the context of where his world is really what it amounts to. And as I said, I'm not trying to say everything about the whisk is biased, but even in the, I don't know what in the Pace case in Chicago, where the judge decided he was the one who could determine what was biased or not. He threw out all the consultants' comments and took the whisk and the Stanford Binet and decided that there were 9 questions on these 2 tests that were culturally biased. Well, who was Burson, the lawyer who was at the time APA's lawyer, who now became the president of APA recently and passed and is no longer, but he wrote an article comparing Judge Grady in Chicago, the Pace case judge, who, as I said, took all the items and decided himself what was biased as compared to the consultants that we had. And Burson said that Judge Grady's decision was somewhat naive or embarrassingly unprofessional is really what he said. We had the data to demonstrate the difference in results when you apply situations to different groups. He just decided it was his decision what was biased and what wasn't. But again, I'm not saying that everything, well, I said earlier, what you want to find out is how the child's cognitive functions operate. And if, as a good psychologist, you can help understand him or get him to explain to you how he did it,
Right.
or why he did it, and that's what's so important.
That's exactly right. So I don't think it's so much the test as it is the professional, because that's why they have the words.
But you see, we're not
test the
trained to
limits.
think when we're administering a test.
But
We're
test the
trained to
limits.
get an answer.
When someone doesn't quite put the block designs together, you can test the limits, right?
Yes.
And give them a hint here, a hint there. And so
I
forth.
had a child years and years ago, I'll never forget this. He took the, not block design, but the comprehension series of pictures where the person goes in a window, steals something, comes out and runs into a policeman. He had them in a different order, and I asked him to explain. He said, well, the guy went in and he heard the police, he came out. He conned the policeman, and then he went back in and got the jewelry. And this is his word. He conned the policeman.
That's clever.
I hope you gave him credit for that.
Yes, I did. Because he understood the situation and could justify it, explain it very clearly. And that's the kind of thing that a good psychologist would do. You want to find out how he functions
Right.
and what you can do to help him become more effective. And the only way to do that is to get him to respond in a certain way, or to get him to respond, and you understand that.
So-
Good school psychologists will ask, well, why did you get I wouldn't be this blunt about it.
Right.
How did you do it? If it's the wrong answer, you can ask, how'd you do it? At the same time, I found it very clever on my part, because I'm so clever. I'm kidding. Even when students get it correct, an answer on the tests and the scales, I ask, how did you go about figuring it out? So again, I'm a supporter of most of these tests, but it's the way the psychologist figures it out. And the last part of it is the way school psychology is going nowadays. You plug in the numbers into a program thing on the computer, it sends out, spits out a canned report, and it takes no creative thinking at all, and to do this 50-page report,
Mhm.
40-page report, as opposed to the psychologist, not the test, psychologist having taken copious notes on this or that, why'd you do it this way, why'd you do it that way, and test the limits, writing that out into the report. But the
One
way
of the things that I used to demand of the psychologist I supervised was to be able to find out how the child did what he did.
Right.
And then write in your report the things that you think the parents would need, the teacher would need, and the student would need to become more effective in what they're
Exactly
doing.
right.
All right, we have time for one more question.
So I wrote my thesis on the Larry P. ruling, and I looked at how satisfied school psychologists were with the law and its ramifications, and overall school psychologists were really unsatisfied with how it had really addressed the problem. And I think that, the problem being that overrepresentation was the main concern, that African American students were being placed in classrooms with the educatively mentally retarded at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. Sorry, but it's still a problem. Overrepresentation is a problem nationally, it's a problem in California still, and so my question is, if we're going to do dynamic assessment, how does that look in the schools, and how does that work to help identify and meet eligibility? So if I have to, meet an eligibility criteria, how am I doing that with dynamic assessment? And then also, does RTI play a role in possibly being a better way of kind of providing services to students that's not categorical, so we're identifying need, putting them in groups that meet their needs, and working to provide services that way. Obviously, there are students that won't fit that model, students with significant intellectual disability, but I just think it's interesting that it's still a problem, despite banning IQ tests and the use of them.
I'm not sure if there's a question.
No, I just,
I'll go ahead and address this, just for the sake of time. So if you're familiar with the specific learning disability options A, B, and C, option B and C have been around for a long time, and that's one way in which mediated learning has worked, because that's the way I did it when I came out of San Diego State. I'm one of those few, 10% maybe, who actually use mediated learning and dynamic assessment in my reports. And I was always able to put it within that language and have a conversation, especially under option C. But I had to do a lot to prove in regards to the team's eligibility decision in regards to either specific learning disability. When it came to ID, there were other things which was added as a result of the Larry P. Court case. So there was a lot of gains. One, you have to do an observation. Some places you have to fill out that form. That wasn't happening before, right? You have to do the adaptive behavior scales if you're thinking about MR. People are just doing it. No adaptive anything. So if you don't have an observation, you have no adaptive scales, you got a problem. You're just making it up. Nice and pretty with some good test scores, but you're still making it up. So those are requirements now. I can't see someone doing an assessment without those two things, especially if they're considering ID or what used to be known as MR. Okay. The whole label, EMR, is gone. Nobody talks about that anymore. The challenge has been, and Dr. Judy McBride, who hired me up at Long Beach, she used to always say, and she'd tell me, she'd kind of say it in my ear, look, the price for freedom is eternal vigilance. So these things come back around. If you've ever read Critical Race Theory by Derek Bell, he talks in particular, but the one that I really got to know was by Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate. And they talk about critical race theory in education. It's about access to property. And every 25 years there's a gain, then there's a pushback. There's a gain, there's a pushback. So one point of clarification, it's not a law. Brian Leung over at LMU, who used to work here at San Diego State, always reminds me, it's not a law. It's simply a memo by the California Department of Education. It can be challenged, but however, you have to show that you're addressing these issues. And I'm going to say it again, people have not addressed these two things. What do black parents want and need? Nobody's done that, by and large, in mass. We've done it individually, but we haven't done it in mass. That's a huge concern. So the other one is actually addressing overrepresentation. So I work with two colleagues and another one who I used to work with at Long Beach. They wrote a good piece in 2005. 25 years after Larry P., not much has changed. They had the same kind of company. You've updated. I think I even read your thesis, right? And I read Francis Dizon's dissertation from Chapman as well about this issue. But we're still not addressing this conversation we need to have with parents and moving policy and society forward. It's just us. It's mainly just school psychologists. We've got to take it outside. We've got to take it outside. So speaking of that, I wanted to present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Harold Dent on behalf of the California Association of School Psychologists. We appreciate your commitment to serving children and families, get this, worldwide.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. This is Sunday afternoon. I appreciate the fact that you're here, and it's been a pleasure. Take care.
Thank you
very much.
So, give us maybe 2 weeks, because it's going to take me a bit to edit, but we'll be posting through Cal State Long Beach, and then it will be, the link for this will be available on CASP. So I'm hoping folks will pose questions even on the CASP Facebook page or on the Southern California Association of Black Psychologists page. And I'll have links both there. Before y'all leave, I did want to thank a few people. Dr. Tanika Duran-Green, who got this space for us, and she's the chair of San Diego State. SANCAS, the local affiliate for the California Association of School Psychologists, they got the word out to a lot of folks. Also, the San Diego Association of Black Psychologists, at least the chapter here, as well as the Southern California Association. And also the local chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. They got the word out as well. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank
Yes. Please. Three, two, one. There we go.
Dr. Dent.
I am.
I know you went to school here. You went through the and I thought you were familiar. I was thinking you might have been in the T program. I kept looking at this. Yeah, but I didn't have this either. What's going on? That's what you want. Because I was at high school. Because I was in high school. Yes, there it is. Okay.
Flash. I don't know if it's flash. I don't think it's I thought I saw a flash, but
Have them like pick up from the box and then
thank you. Oh, okay. I know. We have a lot of that.
Dr. Dent, it's my pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure. Keep up your good work. I appreciate it. I'm not trying to say everything is everybody's name is wrong. Yes,
Just finding out how, discussing the
that's what it's all about, finding out how they vote.
Makes a more interesting report also.
Thank you. I'm one of the few non-school Kaiser psychologists. I'm going to be doing this for
Good year.
You do too. Thank you, thank you.
With the executive statement, I'm not talking or anything, but I was a student at my graduate work back in the 90s.
All right, so let's see if I can, I'm
I've been around national.
check it out. Make sure you're okay. Oh, yeah.
Okay, one more. One more for the camera guys. Carol, turn this way. Nice. I think that's good. Oh, my Lord. One more. I'm not good with this, so.
Yeah, he was the intern last year. Yeah, he is good.
Okay.
That's good. There you go.
I think that's better. I've got hers anyway.
Now we gotta get out of your car.
Okay.
I think I've seen you speak before.
Okay.
I remember, I think, Ellen,